That's Jesse on Zoom. Thank you, Jesse. Jeremy, welcome. So welcome to session 5 of the labor question. Question 5 about we'll file you in all the way. Steve Fraser is a historian, writer, and editor who has been analyzing American capitalism and class structure for decades. Among other books he's published include Every Man, Speculator, A History of Wall Street's Role in American Life, and The Age of Acquiescence, The Life and Death of American Resistance to Organized Wealth and Power. He has been graciously volunteering his time with us and enriching all of our lives this summer. And we have this session, we have 2 more with Steve, so we'll come back for our final 2. Steve, thank you. And the floors.
Thank you. We did not want to introduce, maybe you all know each other. Well, in the past, we've introduced.
You can do a quick round of intro.
You want to do that? Or
yeah. Sure, we can just say names, pronouns, like EFA range, if you remember. Is that all you want, or a little more?
That was it. Yeah.
Okay. I'm Alice here, and I'm a chief.
See someone else? Alex Steve Bell. Carl Lighthouse. Peter.
Annie Sheeper.
I'm Steve Fraser. I'm leading the discussion and written books, and I've been an activist my whole life.
Armand and my first name. Jeremy, he, him. I'm the co-chair of NYCT second, 11 North Brooklyn.
Hank, he, him, Laura Manhattan. Jesse, he, him, and North Brooklyn.
Paul, he, himself.
Dave, him. I'm a recent transplant from Philadelphia. PSA, I live in Bed-Stuy. I've been a friend.
I'm Dave Hillard. I am education planning committee. I live in Central Brooklyn.
I'm Ethan, relatively new to the PSA. Not new to this course, I guess.
Okay, so thank you for braving the heat.
Oh, it's one more vote.
Sorry. Yeah, so thanks for being here. We're handing out the merits to those people who did not come today, scared away by the heat. On the day after Labor Day, of all days, it should have been here, but I appreciate you guys coming out. Those of you who have been here before the earlier sessions know that I tend to blabber on and on. I'm going to try to discipline myself and not do that. This time, I have various devices that I figured out in my head. To tell myself discipline. Alice has noticed key. When I was before I was born, there's apparently a kind of amateur show called Major Bows. I think a live theater show and a radio show. And like amateurs would compete in acts. They could play the piano, they could sing, kind of like American Idol, I guess. You know, pre-modern technology and all that. Major Bows was the host. And if Major Bows decided different than American Idol, you were no good. He had a hook. And he would say, Major Bows, and hook you off the stage. So, Alice, you're supposed to say that to me, and I don't care. And the other thing I urge everybody to do, which I know I've done in the past, but stop me whenever you feel you have a comment or question. make. Don't worry about interrupting me because I'm kind of chaotic anyway. So I normally, Doug and Annie have prepared quotes, which I've sent them ahead of time, but I figured I couldn't be so audacious as to send them stuff on this holiday, so I didn't. But I have some that I'm going to read that will help me, help you, I hope, through this. And I'm going to begin with a quote from C. Wright Mills, who I assume all or many of you know. If you don't, he was an eminent left-wing sociologist and kind of thought of in some ways as the godfather of the new left. Wrote a lot of books in the 50s and 60s. In 1960, he wrote a letter, an open letter to the New Left. And it was published in the New Left Review, because there is a New Left in Britain as well as here. And it said this: do not ask for whom the bell tolls. No, he didn't write. But he wrote the kind of the contemporary equivalent. He said, the working class, this is the quote, as the historic agency in the advanced capitalist countries has either collapsed or become more ambiguous. Such a labor metaphysic is a legacy of Victorian Marxism that is now quite unrealistic. And then he went on to say that the working class has lost its status as, and this is the quote, the necessary level, meaning the level of social transformation. So he was sort of saying, don't ask for who the bell tolls to the left, it's tolling to the truth. And the purpose of our last sessions, this point and beyond this one, is to sort of think about whether he was right or not. And this session is about how he was right, about the eclipse of the labor question, a long period following the New Deal. And I'm going to try to be very telegraphic about this in accounting for this rather profound and mysterious phenomenon, the fading away of the labor metaphysic, not the labor question in terms of bargaining and trade unionism and so on, but the labor metaphysic as the key to what would be social transformation, revolution in America. Yes,
We have a request from Zoom for.
Now just put it on the chair.
Okay, so I'm going to first begin with some quotes. The first thing I want to talk about in accounting for this is what I'm going to call the domestication of the labor movement in the post-war era. Now, some of that, we know from the last session, had already begun to happen in the years of the New Deal, where a kind of labor bureaucracy had emerged that was curtailing some of the more impetuous rank-and-file rebellion and guaranteeing a certain kind of discipline. But now what we're talking about is the Cold War and the domestication of the labor movement in the Cold War. So let me read you these quotes. We have no classes in this country. That is why the Marxist theory of class struggle has gained so few adherents. In the final analysis, the interests of the farmer, the factory hand, business and professional people, and white-collar toilers proved to be the same. That was said by Philip Murray, the president of the United Steelworkers Union, and also, until there was an AFL-CIO, the head of the CIO after John Lewis stepped down. Here's a second quote about the domestication of the labor movement in the Cold War era. We do not seek to recast American society in any particular doctrinaire or ideological image. We seek an ever-rising standard of living. And this should be reminiscent of what we talked about in the last session. That is to say, this commitment to a kind of mass consumer capitalism that would remediate the conflicts that had characterized the 30s and many decades before that. That was said by George Meany, president of the AFL-CIO. Here's another one. The class struggle, if it occurs at all, does so without ideologies, without red flags, without May Day parades. That was said by a very distinguished center liberal sociologist named Seymour Martin Lipset. He said that in 1960. And then finally, one final one, the New Deal reforms, which initially offered substantial if limited, benefits to the struggle for workers' control has evolved into a restrictive quagmire from which working people are now struggling to escape. And that was said by one of the most distinguished labor historians of our time, who passed away recently, David Montgomery, and he said that in 1970. So what those quotes are suggesting is that the Cold War had a profound effect on the labor movement, profound, on everything else about American society. And in accounting for the eclipse of the labor metaphysic, it is an important starting point. First of all, it introduces into labor politics and everything else in it, all politics in America, a climate of fear. With respect to the labor movement itself, the most notorious example of that is the passage of the Taft-Hartley Act, which outlaws sympathy as a social emotion. That's what it really does, because by law, we're no longer allowed to engage in sympathy strikes, secondary boycotts, jurisdictional strikes. All of these things are outlawed. Right to work, the right for states to pass right to work laws, which are anti-union laws, is established in that act. The injunctive power of the government to intervene and stop strikes is in that act. And not most importantly, labor unions are not allowed to donate to political candidates. This is in the Taft-Hartley Act. And finally, it is demanded by the Act that every leader of a labor union take a non-communist oath, that they are not members of the Communist Party. So this is a wholesale kind of shutting down coercively of left alternatives within the labor movement. And as I say, sympathy is what those mass strikes were about that we talked about in the 19th century. Sympathy is the core of what the labor question can be, because it crosses all lines and establishes this social connectedness. They want to outlaw that, and they do outlaw it. Now, what this leads to in the case of labor is a more and more cautious, conservative, George Meany, Philip Murray attitude about what we can and can't do. And it chills the whole political atmosphere. Everything now, not just sympathy strikes, but civil rights, freedom of speech, all kinds of causes that had been part of the struggle for democracy and equality in America become tainted by the Cold War and chilled. So you're afraid to say and do anything. And the labor movement, after all, had been vital not only to organizing its own movement for equality and justice on the shop floor, but in leading the way for movements for social justice and democracy generally. The Cold War shuts that down, and you have this politics of fear. And so the labor movement turns inward and wants to protect what it's got already. And I remember, last session, someone mentioned the private welfare state and the Treaty of Detroit. So what happens is the labor movement becomes more and more cautious about what it's going to do. It tries initially to organize the South. And those of you who were here last session may remember how important that was and what a failure it was. And they try again after the war. It's called Operation Dixie. It fails. And that's critical to change, to realign in the Democratic Party. Can't do it. And then what they begin to do is become more and more bureaucracy. The Treaty of Detroit is a 5-year contract which trades cash for discipline on the shop floor, for productivity, for speed up, and so on. It's your money or your life, and the choice becomes money. And that is one way the trade union movement submits and becomes a prisoner of this mass consuming capitalism, although it enjoys doing so. I don't need to say there was great rebellion, and we'll get to that in a moment. But yes.
There's Detroit. To repeat that.
Yeah.
And one other thing, what is there of management and that of the right of workers to tell management what they could and could not do? I'm sorry, so I just.
No, it's fine. Yes, the management is more, in a way, more concerned in the lead up to World War II and during World War II with establishing discipline and stability on the shop floor than they are about paying money and so on. Absolutely. They for a moment, for how many years, 3, 4, 5 years, the shop floor becomes a contested domain. Workers, there's all kinds of rank and file rebellions. Sometimes official union leaderships are doing it to express the kind of desires that this period of the 30s had unleashed. And management is they want stability. And they already now are reconciled to unions. Like it used to be they are, but the unions need for them to play a functional role. And that role is to stabilize the shop floor, cut down on enormous turnover, constant stoppages of production, soldiering, malingering, all the band workers that bosses used to describe workers who were trying to survive the shop floor. This is what the union does. Okay, so so you get this private welfare state, meaning that the collective bargaining agreements at the UAW, the IUE, the rubber, all the major industrial unions, they get good contracts, and they establish all these fringe benefits, pensions and healthcare and so on. We're familiar with it. At one point in the 30s, the CIO stood before the country as a social unionist movement, arguing on behalf of all working people for precisely those things. Increasingly, the trade unions become more and more conservative and just want to preserve those benefits for their own members, because they feel anything more daring than that. They've made this marriage with the elite of the Democratic Party. They're committed to it. They're empowered by it, and they don't want to risk losing in this atmosphere. Yeah.
This is just a little, to add to that. I've worked for about 70 years in the public sector as a staff member, and every union contract in California, the preamble, that basically says the scope of representation. Always the first paragraph is management has the right to manage, and that's it. Then there's all these other things that are sort of mandatory topics of bargaining, but it's very clearly that cut is
exactly. And if we go back all the way back to our earlier sessions, when George McNeil says he who sells labor sells himself, that's what's being ended here, that kind of conception of what you're really struggling about. You're trading on the labor market, and the trade is you give up all of that, right, to which workers used to have, where they have a certain amount of control of the shop floor, and you get the pension, and you get that. These are important things. You get the health care, and you get the high wages, and you get the cost of living adjustments, which the treaty in Detroit guarantees the auto workers in Detroit, 50, I think, I don't know. Anyway, and what this does, private welfare state means also that not only it's social isolation, a labor movement that at one point was expansive and embracing all kinds of working people, increasingly is isolated from that huge, at its acme. The organized labor movement in America maybe organized a third of the labor force, and that's say in the mid-50s, maybe early 60s. So we're talking about 2/3 of the labor force not organized. And at one point, it was the goal of the CIO to organize the unorganized. What else would be more basic than that? And now, as you protect your own turf, you're increasingly isolated from that world. And that world, I don't want to exaggerate this, is heavily women and African Americans, especially in the South, where, and of course, as we know, I don't know that. Anyway, you're cutting yourself off from all kinds of sectors that are unorganized and often also sites of discrimination and so on. Okay. Now, there's another, this is fear and trembling. This is very scary and not to be underestimated how frightening this change in the political atmosphere is. But there's another side to this whole, and it's called embouchement. And it became the fascination of left-wing intellectuals and others who felt the labor movement was betraying its mission and doing so because it had been seduced, not cowed, seduced. And I'll read you some quotes about that. And well, I'm glad about the president. It's not just left-wing elections. It's mainstream American culture. So here's the first quote. The rich man smokes the same sort of cigars as the poor man, shaves with the same sort of razor, uses the same sort of telephone, vacuum cleaner, radio, TV sets. That's the New York Herald Tribune in 1952. Plugging in to this new zeitgeist, right? There are no classes. Another one. The class struggle doctrine of Marx was the invention of a lonely refugee scribbling in the dark recesses of the British Museum. He abhorred and detested the middle class. He did not foresee that in America, labor respected and prosperous would constitute, with the farmer and the businessman, the hated middle class. He was the president of the United States by Eisenhower in 1955. This is the ideological triumph that the labor movement is in the midst of. Here's another one. The people recognize themselves in their commodities. They find their soul in their automobile, hi-fi set, stoop-level home, kitchen equipment. That's Herbert Marcuse, a left-wing intellectual in One-Dimensional Man, 1964. And finally, the class struggle interests him less and less. The idea of the working class as an oppressed or exploited class, or the romanticized idea of the working class as foremost in the struggle for progress and social justice, is fading from his mind. That's a sociology of it. Anyway, good one. So there's a kind of intellectual, ideological, and this has long, we've talked about this before in this class. It has long roots that go back deep into our culture, the sense that America is, look, this is America, it's American, there are two versions of American exceptionalism. One is the business of only sectarian leftists who know that the Communist Party had split in the 20s about somebody who doesn't have. They were arguing before the commentary that America is exceptional and take a different road. But the real American exception that does matter is this one, that America, and this is Thomas Jefferson, is immune. And it's immune. It's a middle class society. That is, it's a classless. It's a classless. The middle class is the class that is no class. Everybody's in. This is a great triumph, and it's difficult to be a labor movement trying to maintain the cause of your alleged historic mission in an ideological atmosphere like that. And there's a loss of faith. There's a vast literature about bourgeois. Every conceivable left intellectual writes about it, and mainstream scholars write about it, and there's a host of fascinating things. It's really it's symptomatic of a kind of emotional depression, because all the sociological studies, and there are billions of them done then, don't find that when they go into these working class communities, both in Britain, Latin Britain, and in America. Actually, they do indeed say, yes, they're very oriented to the marketplace, consuming and all that kind of stuff, but they feel sharp distinctions between the way they live, what they value, and the middle class who they either resent, don't like, envy, but they completely recognize a sharp social distinction. But intellectuals, whether they're mainstream or left or right, hearing that. And then finally, just to, I like these quotes, and this is part of that same process of bourgeois moment. You all know what the kitchen debate was? Some of you do. So, in 1959, 57. Anyway, Richard Nixon, Vice President Richard Nixon, goes to Moscow. An American fair and had been wanting a Russian Soviet fair. Anyway, he goes and to display America's marvels, its consumer marvels, its technological advances. And there's a whole model suburban house. This is suburbia is the new, I remember we talked weeks ago about property independence as a kind of initial strange version of the labor question. Suburbia, if you allow me a little license here, plays that kind of ideological role here. So Nixon goes, and he debates Christian, premier, so, and in debating, who's real? Here's the question. I love the irony. Who's the real class of society? It's not the communists, it's us. And he says, so here you go, here's Nixon. He says, the United States, the world's largest capitalist country, has, from the standpoint of distribution of wealth, come closest to the ideal of prosperity for all in a classless society. As he says that, they're standing in the kitchen in the suburban model house. This is 1957. And then Eisenhower, a couple of years later, says, they, the Soviets, failed to realize that the American worker was not the downtrodden, impoverished vassal of whom Karl Marx wrote. He is self-sustaining, he is a self-sustaining, thriving individual living in dignity and freedom. He said that on time. So the first, what I'm trying to argue here, please stop me anytime you want to continue that, is that the first, this is an overdetermined question. Why the eclipse of the labor question? So I'm only pointing to certain things. To me, the Cold War and these various manifestations of the Cold War are one place we need to look to understand this decline of the labor question. Yes.
So it seems like the fear of the Cold War and all that stuff, Red Scare, etc., it made the labor movement like kind of freeze up a little bit and stuff like that.
Yeah, among other, let me just understand. I should have mentioned this. The CIO, the Antifa CIO, purges, drives out of its ranks 11 unions led by left-wingers, mainly by communists. So we're talking about real material, it's not just an idea. These unions are driven out of the labor movement, but I need to stop it.
And so, like, I guess I have two questions, but I'll pick one of them. Like, what's preventing current unions from doing that right now? It's because,
Nothing.
right? Or like there's no communists left. So
There's certainly very few communists left, but the domination and chilling effect of union bureaucracies is still part of our lives today. There are obviously there's resistance to that. Some of it's successful recently in some unions, which we know about. But sure, that still exists. The Cold War is no longer obviously the excuse for that. Although there are 2 points. The domestic Cold War was, in my view, never about the Soviet Union. It was about the New Deal. It was a domestic, and it was about state intervention, labor regulation, the regulation of business, and so on. It was a rebellion against that, against threats to the family. McCarthy, a lot of his supporters, not working class, but lower middle class, lace curtain Irish people who feel the threat of this increasingly secular. This resonates today, right? Doesn't it? Feel that there's threat to secular society. So that what was I doing? Yes, I'm sorry.
I was wondering also if we're going to touch on patriotism, because I feel like we're going this idea that this whole world, we're all middle class, we're all Americans, we're not thinking about our class identities. We're thinking about this, it's us versus them.
Yeah, well, we said it. I mean, I think that kind of it's a kind of new patriotism that's profoundly colored by anti-communists, by the great threat of the Soviet Union.
It's a question. You said that the question of why the labor movement became more conservative is overdetermined.
Yeah.
And I was wondering, like, the Cold War and that ideological shift is one aspect of that. What are the other ones?
I'm gonna do that.
Oh, okay.
I'm gonna do some, what I meant, what I was doing, giving myself an excuse for not doing all of them, but I am going to. So, yes,
So you mentioned, like. People thought that it was a odd class of society largely because you mentioned a quote where like rich people have like these amenities and so do working class people. How much do you think like of what determines, not theoretically, but just like in our everyday lives, aesthetics plays a role in determining what you are as like working class or if you're upper middle class? Like how much do you think that plays a role into how we think about who is working class and who is like upper class?
what do you think?
I think it in a lot of ways matters more than
Now.
because, yeah,
Why?
because I feel like we're so conditioned to be reactionary in that way, which is like you look at something and you react and you're like, oh, that it's like the high status of something, that I can't have.
Conditioned by media,
Yeah.
what other people think about?
There's more product differentiation, right?
Yeah.
Like fancy cars, plain cars.
Yeah.
It used to be like rich people grew up with Plymouths too,
Yeah.
or fancy versions,
Yeah.
but not
Right.
$200,000 Lamborghini.
I think that's true, but it's like there's so many opportunities to like buy anything now on credit, so it's just like you can, if you are a working class person, you can look like you are not working class.
Yes, as long as you can show that it won't.
Until it gets really
Yeah,
bad.
Yeah,
it's
yeah.
killing you, but yeah, but you'll do it in order to
Great
be.
opportunities.
Yeah,
Well, and I think arguably part of like what the culture industry generally tries to show is sort of like the average person and kind of like generally projects this image of like everyone as being sort of kind of upper middle class, which in a sense is a lie, but also, you know, there's a kind of identification that happens with culture and art and music and films and whatever. You know, I mean, I remember when I taught in the South Bronx being like shocked that my students liked High School Musical, because I was like, you guys realize they have like an atrium in their high school and you're poor. Like, there's a real difference between you and those students, right? But that wasn't the subjective experience they had, just enjoying the musical or whatever. And I feel like a fair bit of American culture is oriented in that direction.
yeah, I would answer that, I'm sorry, yeah, go ahead. Yeah,
I was just gonna say, like, also, I remember a time when advertising still tried to sell a product based on something the product did. that was
Yeah.
beneficial, it's utilitarian. And now it's all just about selling images, sex appeal, perfection. It's gone way beyond any rational
yeah.
aspect, which is, I think, why it's so powerful.
I think also, yeah, you were gonna talk.
Yeah, I mean, I think about this and because I see my nieces who are on IG and they have no money. So they go on vacation and oh, you use money, it's $200. And next thing I see, they're on like posting IG and they're in the fancy hotel and you would never know. I mean, they're not poor.
Yeah.
My family is generally middle class, but they themselves are right now, they're working class.
Yeah.
They make no money, but you would never know from the way they present themselves.
Well, what do you mean? You mean the working class makes no money in the middle class does? See, what is this middle class?
That's a very good point. So that's so.
Yeah, this is part of the insidious way we think about these things. Now, that's was born now, was born then. You know, working class were poor, but it didn't mean poor to be working class. And now it kind of does, the kind of cultural persuasion that suggests that that's what we really need. It's not a relationship to capitalism.
No, exactly.
It's a relation to how much you got. And that's a change.
And real quick, I rarely use it
Yeah.
in the sense of to capital, except when I'm speaking like Marxism. But I think my point is that there seems to be something that allows maybe it's always been like this, that allows people to signify that they don't come from the working class. They were
Yes.
It's just like one thing that I'm curious about though is like, I mean, digging in a bit, like the actual, like the effects of, like, I mean, I do kind of wonder, like, this seemed like immediately in the post-war period, like post-trade all this, like there really was like unprecedented like degree of prosperity
Oh,
for those
absolutely.
workers
Yeah.
that like can't imagine like the effect on.
Yeah, it never would have had the traction had they not been, yes. Yeah, question, this is called by economists the Great Compression, meaning a closing of the gap in the distribution of wealth in this sort of, whatever it's 30-year period, whatever the gap is, no question that happened, and partly it happened because of unions. Which I'm sorry, somebody else.
Yeah, I mean, like a bunch of like luxury goods, I feel like they get advertised or marketed to people in terms of like aspirational goods,
Yeah,
like in and of itself.
yeah,
Like, you know, the aspiring to be a higher class is in and of itself the product being sold.
yeah, yes, well, I got it. Yes, and
And so in this period, I think it's 15 years after World War II, 20 years after World War II, in the height of the Cold War, as you say, in your quote, there was this ideological war against socialism, tried socialism to an aggressive external enemy. That wasn't the model of good behavior at the time, you know. But and there was Taft-Hartley, but the New Deal was not rolled back completely, right?
Right.
Unions were not crushed; they were incorporated
Yes,
in a
that's
way,
right.
right?
Right.
And living standards, as Comrade you said, did of course substantially improve for masses of millions of people, right? But there were nevertheless, some significant strikes in those 20 years. I remember as a kid, all the airlines went out in 1966, like almost like an industry general strike. And it wasn't until the turn, so when you say the labor question was kind of going away, maybe in the ideological war, whatever, but labor as a force was kind of, in some ways, more powerful or had a bigger interest group mediation role, whatever, in that period than in the neoliberal era from the early mid-70s till today, right? So when you're talking about the disappearance of the labor question, isn't it kind of later than?
well, it depends what one means by the labor question.
Right.
If you mean by it, as Seawright knows, suggests people used to mean the kind of question which leads to the transformation, overthrow of capitalism. And in this class, the labor question has taken many forms in American history. Some of the most pedestrian are what should be the division of wages and profits, and we bargain in the labor market about that. Some parties have greater power to bargain, others less, more, et cetera. That's a labor question. Another labor question is how do we transcend this acrimony? We build company towns. That's a solution to a labor question. But in the Seawright Mills sense, he's saying it's over. That's what the course has mainly kind of preoccupied itself with. You're completely right. The longest strike in American history, I think, maybe not, was the steel strike of 1959. Goes on forever and ever. The labor movement is powerful. It's at its most powerful as a bargainer in the labor market in these decades. Come out of the New Deal and the war in power as a George Bernard Shaw, of all enlightened people, once said that trade unionism is the capitalism of the working class. And that's, but you understand what he meant, that he was not against unions, strange guy in many ways, but what he's saying is that it operates within the framework. The labor question was always an attempt to get beyond that framework in various ways.
Yeah, this is, and again, stop me if this goes too far afield, but I guess one thing I've been thinking about that sort of like maybe complicates, or I'm curious if you're thinking about the Treaty of Detroit, you know, the story you're telling about it as placed in the 50s, is that arguably, I don't know, recently I was talking to these like Austrian trade unionists, and one of the things about, you know, whatever boring social democracy in European countries is just how many more institutions they have and how much more their labor movement seems to think institutionally. So, you know, works councils at every single factory, a central labor council that does sectoral bargaining. And it seems to me that there is arguably a kind of strain in American labor politics that goes very far back, actually, that kind of doesn't think about creating long-standing institutions, but is actually quite like a little Emersonian, like we're going to rely on ourselves. So on the one hand, the Treaty of Detroit is this kind of, you know, broader concession of the Cold War, but on the other hand, saying like we're going to provide healthcare for our members is also something that like Samuel Gompers said. And, you know, when he opposed doing political action, or even like the outlaw figures you were looking at, the IWW, when they're like, you know, we're not going to build, we're not going to take contracts, we're not going to do, there is a level of just kind of like hostility to building institutions and a kind of self-reliance that seems to go very deep in labor politics.
So, I was gonna later in the session, should we ever get to it, I was gonna ask,
Sorry.
but don't fine, I mean, I'm happy this and all. It's a tricky question. Part of the Second International, the Social Democrats you're talking about, their origins, argued that reform is the royal road to revolution. Eventually you get there. We have studied a period in the New Deal which would suggest otherwise, and it didn't lead that way. It may have led to managers of discontent, the rule that, you know, C. Wright Mills talks about in writing the book The Power of the Trade Union Bureaucracy, that doesn't lead that way. I don't know what's right or wrong. This is obviously a pregnant question today, and we'd have to be a lot stronger to really have traction. But, you know, does reform evolve naturally into more and more power, institutional, otherwise political, or no, does it not? Because you have to reckon with your host or the framework. That is to say, the New Deal circles I talked about 2 weeks ago, that were elite circles, business circles, had, and there are such circles today, in my view, have a different way of approaching the dilemma that the labor movement faces, that keep things, that prevent that reform moving inevitably in a revolutionary direction. So we could open that up right now. Here's the thing. I don't care. You know, you're right, and somebody else made the same point. Oh, and I was going to talk next about the big change which happens at the end of the 60s, which is a phase change in global capitalism, which produces further pressures that really make the revival of the labor question extremely difficult. I can talk about that, or we can just, I mean, this is a great discussion, so we can just do this.
Keep up.
So, I mean, this is familiar, I think, to a lot of you, but, you know, 1968 is like 1919, it's an incredible year. There were revolts and revolutions all over the world, obviously, in the United States, you know these things, there's this huge anti-Vietnam War movement, the civil rights movement has already accomplished historic change in America, in the days of rage in Chicago, you know, 68, you know what I'm right, 68.
With the removal.
I was going to get to that. That's the climax.
Sorry,
You stole my point. Don't do that. Right. So, and then of course there's the May Days in France, Paris, which is combines student and worker uprisings. There's the Prague Spring. There's massive demonstrations in Tokyo and Mexico City, and then there is the collapse, near collapse of the post-war political economy that had regulated international trade and monetary policy. And I don't want to get into this too much. There is a United States business and industry begins to face intense competition from Japan and Germany, which have now revived. They have, you know, capitalism is always cyclically plagued by, that's why it is compelled to engage in what somebody called creative destruction. Ossified means production because the competitive, the technology and industry in Germany and Japan was brand new. It's much more efficient, much more productive in key industries than was true in the United States. The United States had authored that revival from the Marshall Plan and so on. It needed to create markets abroad that devastated societies and economies. But by 1970 or so, there are increasing runs, speculative runs on the dollar. The dollar can no longer maintain its fixed. Anyway, the point is this enters a period that I don't want to get into that. A period of what we're very well familiar with. Begins then in the 70s of deindustrialization, of a auto-cannibalizing of American industry by financial circles who devour a lot of, in order to accumulate capital in the financial sector, a lot of the value in invested in American industry of various kinds. Capital flows abroad. The world's working class, people talk about the vanishing of the world. The world's working class is bigger now than it's ever been in the history of the world, but it's increasingly abroad. And so there's this massive outflow of productive capital abroad. There is this literal cannibalizing of industries. Companies are purchased in these merger and acquisitions by junk bonds and so on in the 80s and 90s, and dissected, sold off the parts, basically different, and shut down, massive layoffs. And what does this mean? It means that a whole way of life in the industrial heartland and elsewhere is wiped out. Not only are unions either wiped out or forced on the deep defensive into a long period of concession bargaining, just giving up stuff, whether that's their pensions or their health care benefits or their wages, in order to hold on to what they can of their presence in these industries. Whole communities are wiped out. This is devastating. This is a kind of dispossession that, in a way, reminds us of the primitive accumulation we've talked about earlier in this class. Except the primitive accumulation is happening internal to the capitalist system. It's actually devouring the wherewithal of America's industrial life. And so, and to wipe out communities is to wipe out all that dense network, Jeremy, of institutional life, not just unions, community centers, brotherhoods of various kinds, churches. These are ghost towns. And how do you think about resisting that when your union is on deep defensive, it's giving up everything, it's being eliminated, you are downwardly mobile, you are lucky if you get a job at Walmart, paying or you're hired in this concession bargaining includes two-tier contracts, which we're very familiar with now, but long predate now, so that new hires are hired at wages their grandfathers would have made more than. So that this is a very, very difficult thing to mount any kind of resistance to. Let me stop there. Let's talk about that for questions or discussion. Yeah.
Well, just are you going to cover the growing militancy, shock militancy?
You know what? I'm leaving out for now because I know you guys have read that. I hope you've read that Cal Winslow essay, and I think there's a little bit of it in my essay. But I thought I'd leave it for a question I want to ask you all. But we can talk about it now. I am. Yes. Yes.
I was just to make a comment because my family is West Town, Ohio. So further explanation, I think the lawsuit, and that it is very hard to think about collective bargaining when your job is going overseas.
Yeah.
Like you're not thinking about that.
And you have this wholesale assault by the business and the government. You know, there was the famous PATCO of Reagan, right? PATCO, you know, that is the air traffic controllers, he busts their strike. That's a signal to the whole business world that it's open season on the labor movement. And so all kinds of, you know, today, businesses engage in practices all the time which are against the law, because it's been 20, 30 years since anybody was enforcing the National Labor Relations Act. They threaten to move if you bargain too tough, they're not allowed to do that. They have these company meetings on premises, you're compelled to go, they're not allowed to do that. They fire union organizers, they're not allowed to do that. These are all against the law. It doesn't, but the tables have turned. The power is really on the other side. Moreover, what makes the condition of people like your family worse is that this financialization, auto-cannibalism of the economy is accompanied by austerity, so that the welfare state is reeled down, and so that unemployment insurance was never that great, gets worse. The percentage of your income that you get goes down. The percentage of the workforce covered by unemployment insurance goes down in states, and states can regulate this. And then of course all kinds of other, so it's austerity, which further instills this climate of fear and demoralization. And then you have people, and then you have in more recent time, but not right now, is the development of this precarious workforce, this profoundly insecure workforce, which doesn't go from day to day, or the invention of the so-called independent contractor, like, no longer, that person not only has to pay for all this stuff, let's say he's a trucker, he has to pay for his truck and all that, he's not covered anymore with other national labor relations because he's a businessman. So he's a contractor. So you don't even have what is already by that time the tattered remnant of the kind of welfare state protective shield, and so on. So, we have in this class talked about how phase changes in capitalism have often ushered in major transitional moments in the history of the labor class. Obviously, the Great Depression is one such moment. The populist and Knights of Labor moment was another, when you had the first major capital accumulation and the wiping out. Anyway, this is another such. And then, let me just figure it out. I just want to finish this. So then, what you also get, to make matters that much worse, is the abandonment of the working class by its kind of ally, the Democratic Party. That's where it had gone to and was powerful and had real influence. Listen, to make your point even more emphatically about that middle period. I mean, Medicare and Medicaid don't happen without the labor movement's contribution to that. There's no question. Now, neoliberal Bill Clinton Democratic Party has no real any longer any use for the labor movement, and it's a symptom of how abject the leadership has become. Maybe I shouldn't put it that way. Maybe they had no alternatives. That they keep offering themselves up as electoral machinery and getting almost nothing in return from neoliberal democracy. And so, if you're a working person and you have voted regularly because you thought the New Deal was great, gave you all this stuff and it helped you and so on, and now your helpmate, your political helpmate, is gone, it's really difficult to resist, and some don't resist and do something quite different. But I'm going to hold off that for a moment. You almost imagine what that is, but they leave the Democratic Party. But we're going to get to that moment. Let me stop there and say, ask if there are other questions about this. Yes.
So back to your point about like community being, hollowed out,
Yeah.
being hollowed out. I feel like that can, even though like we've gone through like this consumerism a little bit, right? I think a lot of that can change too, because like when I have like a one-on-one with a coworker about organizing or about like their issues and their dreams and stuff like that, I feel like my relationship with that coworker becomes elevated. Right before, when we walk past the hallway, I just say hi out of like formality, whatever. Or I don't even say hi at all. But after that one-on-one, after having an organized conversation, after all that kind of builds solidarity, so we walk by each other in the hallway, there's like an extra bit. It's not friendship, but it's like trust, right? And I think like, organizing is like a way to also work, like not just to get better pay, better benefits, but also kind of like build a community from that sense. So even though like we see what happens in, we see a lot of calling out channels and stuff like that, but that can be rebuilt, and I think that does start by organizing.
Yeah, I think that's what we're going to talk about. You're living in a moment when the wheel is turning again, and that's what we're going to talk about. The revival of that question, much more recent times, the last maybe 15 years. So we're going to do that next session. Right, absolutely. That's what we're all hoping can happen. I think it can happen. I want to read some more quotes. I want to read about, because another aspect of the eclipse of labor question, as I'm talking about, we were talking about it, is the transcendence of class issues by issues of race and gender, so that now we're talking about the 60s. So that race becomes, race especially, but also gender discrimination, the critical question around which the left in this I don't know, postmodern, but in this moment after the labor movement has begun to decline, the industrialization is happening, and in the wake of the civil rights movement of the 60s. I want to read you some quotes, and we'll talk about what the significance of that is. Did it happen? Why did it happen? Here are the quotes. The basic cause of Negro poverty is discrimination. That's Business Week in 1964. White racism, is essentially responsible for the explosive mixture which has been accumulating in our cities since the end of World War II. That's the Kerner Commission. You know what that was? The Kerner Commission, for those of you who don't know, was a commission put by the president in the wake of all the urban insurrections of the 60s in ghettos all over America, to explain what are the causes, what's producing this these uprisings. And it was chaired by the governor of Indiana, Kerner, Otto Kerner, is that right?
Oh, no, yeah.
Am I right?
No, I was thinking of Brown.
No, it's the guy from the Midwest. I think it's Otto Kerner. And John Lindsay was on his vice chair. You know who John Lindsay was? Anyway. So that's the Kerner Commission, white racism. What is the value of winning access to public accommodation for those who lack the money to use them? This is Bayard Rustin. You know who Bayard Rustin was? Yes. Okay. Bayard Rustin is a longtime labor organizer, civil rights advocate, socialist, one of the organizers of the March on Washington in 1963, an advisor to King. We cannot be satisfied so long as a Negro in Mississippi cannot vote, and a Negro in New York believes he has nothing for which to vote. That's Martin Luther King in 1963. I had a dream. Hell, we don't need a dream. We need jobs. That's a resident of Watts, 1965 uprising. Now we are grappling with basic class issues between the privileged and the underprivileged. Now we are saying everybody ought to have a job, and everybody ought to have a guaranteed annual income, and everybody ought to live in a decent home wherever he wants to live, and everybody ought to have an adequate education. There are those who are not willing to have this come about. This means messing with the captains of industry. Now, this means we are treading in difficult waters. because it really means that we are saying something is wrong with capitalism. Maybe America must move toward democratic socialism. Who said that? Martin Luther King. Yeah.
What year?
1967. I quantify revolution in dollar terms. Now I see Black people driving around Atlanta in cars that are worth $100,000. That's integration. I keep running into young people who are starting their own businesses. That's integration. I used to know everyone in Atlanta could afford to take an airplane. Now I see Black folks I don't even know flying first class. These people are carrying on the struggle. That's Andrew Young. Andrew Young was a member of the SCLC. What? Yeah. Could be. And was mayor of Atlanta, and of course, UN ambassador. UN ambassador. Just have two more, sorry. Identity politics, that's not the quote, is quote, not an alternative to a class politics, but a form of it. Walter Ben Michaels was right, saying the nation. And then another very distinguished historian of slavery. We have entered another era where race has preempted class. But down the road, America will have to confront the underlying reality of class division in America and the destructive myth of a classless society. That's David Bryan Davis, who's a very, like I said, distinguished historian. So that's an interesting collection of remarks. And let me just, before I ask you to voice your view of them, let me make the point that what King and Rustin are saying, they're drawing on a history, an immediately preceding. It's a funny thing. We think, if we look in retrospect, we think the civil rights thing is one thing and the labor revolution of the 19th, that is a different thing. It's amazing to think that, since they almost happened coincidentally, they didn't, but they're so close to each other in time. And that's a striking rupture in our consciousness. And it's striking because, in fact, the CIO was deeply implicated. And even into the early 60s, the new left is, and the March on Washington has a heavy labor union component. The labor and race questions were considered as intertwined. In all these years of the CIO has unions which discriminate against both African Americans and women, but basically it's a union which invites everybody, skilled, unskilled, Black, white, and so on. It creates an enormous, and there are enormous testimonies from the civil rights movement of that era, of the 30s and 40s, that sees the race question and the labor question as intertwined. And the most memorable moment of that, perhaps, is the threatened March on Washington in 1941 by organized by A. Philip Randolph, which was going to bring, if industry continued, anyway, to end segregation in the armed forces and in employment in war industry. The march never happens because Roosevelt promulgates an order which says you can't get government contracts if you discriminate. And some of that's enforced, some of it isn't. But anyway, he has to do that because of A. Philip Randolph. So there is a moment, and King and Rustin and so on are harkening back to that moment when these things were not seen as if they were lived on separate planets, but were conjoined. And then at some point, that becomes less and less so, and continues to be less and less so into the era that Andrew Young is now talking about well down the road. And this is a powerful transformation. Part of what I'll stop at that promise. What Ombudsman includes, the workers have sold out. They're just filling a belly. This is called goulash capitalism. It was goulash communism in Russia. the Chinese said, and there's goulash capitalists in America, and they've given up their soul. Well, yes, and worse than that, they enjoy white skin privilege. That was the argument of the New Left as it came of age in the 60s. And this is interesting because the New Left has many strands of it. It is anti-capitalist in some of its movements. It's an anti-Vietnam War, anti-imperial instincts betray us. You don't have to be anti-capitalist to be anti-imperial. The whole third world is a testimony to that. However, they were anti-capitalists for a while. And so I'm not saying they weren't at that, but I don't want to get too far. Feeling. But white skin privilege sets up a dynamic which over much time, and because of other things happening apart from that notion and that attitude, deep divisions between and the trade union bureaucracy contributes to that because in large sectors they are discriminating against blacks and women. So it's not like they invented this, but it creates an attitude about the hopelessness of that white working class world. It's so it is racist to the bone, as the Kerner Commission said. The Kerner Commission's argument is a way of escaping responsibility, isn't it? It's blaming all the desperate conditions that led to the insurgencies all over African American America on this kind of innate, universal, even among the most powerless white people. So no structure, no institutions, no power centers are responsible. It's an idea, it's an emotion, and that's what did this. Okay, let me stop there, but this is argumentative.
The racism of white workers, white working class is the claim that that's so fundamental structure and political environment that is wrong.
No, I don't think it's wrong. I think that what happened is that what I think is this, that racism is a form of class struggle. That's a grotesque form of class struggle because those, not only is that, I mean, obviously there are populations that are just racist and they have learned to become so, but that population that was wiped out by deindustrialization and all that kind of thing, who were victimized by capital, by finance capital in particular. This was going to be the last thing I was told to explain this Eclipse and Re-emergence, become the creators and the followers of the politics of resentment. That resentment is, and they know it, I'm going to read you something, but they know is against elites that have done this, a kind of liberal elite, but the black scapegoat for that anger and that resentment and that desperation is always handy because it's built into American culture. Let me read you these quotes and then we can stop it. Tell me what time it is. Okay, I'm good. I have to leave a little early, but we're good. Politics of resentment. Do we have an elitist government? They decreed it's good for people to do certain things. And even though the people don't like to do it, they must do it because this super elite group is so determined. Who is that? That's George Wallace speaking to, this is a quote, the man in the textile mill, the barber and the beautician, and the little businessman. We're sick and tired of the average citizen being taxed to death, while those billionaires like the Rockefellers and the Fords and the Mellons go without paying taxes. Think about this for a minute. Because this we have to understand this, because to simply dismiss what's happened over the last 20 years as a kind of instantation of racism is to miss this dimension of what's been going on. You know, Wallace is for all kinds of, he's a Democrat, and he's for welfare. He's in his state. He's for the right to organize. It's complicated, and anyway, let me go on. The rich liberals, they look down on my little piece of the American dream, my little backyard with the barbecue here. That's a supporter of Mario Procaccino. Some of you probably have no idea who he is, but some, I think you do. Right. Anyway, oh, okay. Oh, I once wrote a book called Limousine Liberal. Procaccino ran against the quintessential limousine liberal for mayor of New York, John Lindsay. Lindsay was a congressman from Silk Stock District of the East Side, and he was Kerner Commission, racism is the enemy. He's a limousine liberal. To the manor born, he went to all the right schools, etc. So Yale Law, you name it, he had it. Procaccino is this a guy, I don't know if he's from Staten Island. He's a Democratic apparition. He's not a racist. He's just a thug. No, he's not a thug. He's a machine. He's a hack. He's a hack. And he is running against Lindsay. And he talks about how Lindsay is a limousine liberal. That is to say, Lindsay wants to integrate schools and stuff like that, and he wants to build housing here and there. But Lindsay and his ilk are immune to the cost of doing that because he drives around in limousines, he must ride the subway, his kids go to private schools. That's the elite object of and he's right, there is a contempt. There is, I'm going to read you a good quote about this. There is a kind of cultural and class contempt that emanates down from elite liberal circles that working class people feel and recognize. Okay,
And Procaccino was the Democratic.
Oh, I'm sorry.
And Lindsay
Yes.
won the mayoral on the Republican and Liberal Party line.
Right, that's right. And then he becomes a strike buster and so on. The unions hated him. There's a great big transit strike in New York at that time. Transit unions, not to be messed with too easily. And Mike Quill, who's the head of the transit union, naturally defies the law. I mean, it's unthinkable. A lot of the Taylor law intimidates unions, but and especially the teachers, it's so scary. A lot of unions have violated that law. It's scary. Real penalties are not minimized. Anyway, transit's right. The judge and Quill says, fuck that, we're not coming back. And the judge sentences him to contempt, and he has to go to jail. And Lindsay says, may the judge drop dead in his black robes. And that was a different era. And, Will was either a Communist Party guy or left wing. Anyway, that's a Mario Poetry. Okay. They looked like characters out of Moon Mullins, and she was their homegrown Mamie made good, sloshing beer at the long tables in the unadorned room of South Boston's social and athletic club, sat a comic strip gallery of tipplers and brawlers, tinseled overdressed dolls. After Mrs. Hicks, so somebody will know what this is, finished reading off a familiar recitation of civic wrongs the other night, the men queued up to give Louise Day Hicks says, their best, unscrewing cigar butts from their chins to bust her noisily on the cheek or pumping her arm as if it were a jackhammer under a trailer truck. That's Newsweek reporting on the Boston anti-busing movement in around 1970, which Louise Day Hicks, this lace curtain Irish Catholic led. And you feel the contempt in that account of who these people are. Are they racist? Yes. Or are they also I'll read you another one. This is Louise standing up against the rich people of the she was standing up against, quote, the rich people of the suburbs on behalf of the working men and women, the rent payer, the homeowner, the law-abiding, tax-paying, decent-living, hard-working, forgotten American. And that's Louise Day Hicks. And then finally, this quote, I don't know if I can know this quote. The federal court orders of 1974 and 75 assured that the burden of immigration would fall disproportionately on the poor of both races. One need not perceive That was part of the limousine liberal accusation. Yeah, raise taxes, but and I shouldn't stop. One need not proceed from a Marxist perspective, as I do not, to observe that class is America's vertical secret, pervasive and persistent, yet rarely confronted in public policy. And that was said by a man, a writer named J. Anthony Lucas, who wrote a very famous Pulitzer Prize-winning book about the Boston movement called Common Ground. Okay, now we can talk. The floor is open. Comments, yes.
It's like I feel like while you're describing all this, I'm thinking of the movie Blue Collar,
Yeah.
which for folks who haven't seen it, I think is like just like a really, you know, I'm a bit biased being from Detroit, but I feel like it's like I mean it's one of the best depictions, representations like of I think this period in particular of this like transformation of like I mean, especially in the case of like, you know, focus on the case of like auto workers, where you go from this like sort of like heroic like solidarity to just, you know, everyone turning on each other.
Right.
And, you know, I think all the time of like, say like the image that's used for like this class, for instance, on like all the postings of like I think the Diego Rivera murals, where you have like this multiracial working class moving an engine block along an assembly line together and kind of like struggling and all this stuff. Like the end of that movie, it's like almost like the exact opposite of that. And I just want to kind of call that out, but also like when I think about that, I think of like this is a period of like, if one thinks of like maybe the 20s, the 30s, and the 40s is a period of like maybe class formation in the United States. This is a period of like class deformation.
Yeah, I think that's a great formulation. That's right. And its political expression is these are all Democrats. They're all Democratic Party, and they migrate out. Wallace is a Democrat. And of course, as you know, I think the Republican Party begins to take note. You know, Wallace does well in auto centers, not just in the South. He does extremely well in places like Michigan and Minnesota and elsewhere. In primaries and even in, 1968, he was 13% of the vote. That does not all come from the South. It comes from some of these northern working class precincts who are fed up with liberalism as they understand it. And so what is happening is this is their home party. They're all Democrats. They're going to migrate out. Nixon and Buchanan and so on, and talk about the silent majority that's waiting there to leave. This is the Democratic Party or parts of it that are waiting to leave because they feel abandoned by elite Democrats. And then there's the actual phenomenon of blue-collar Democrats moving to Reagan in 1980. So there's a kind of political demography that's changing in the course of this politics of resentment, which is becoming more and more powerful. We're going to talk more about it next session, but anyway, yeah, there were other hands. Yes.
The last comment in particular that you've been read about integration,
Yes.
something that I've been about a lot more recently, and the idea of that it seems a lot of the divisions today are what racism is still a thing, obviously, but we like to think that we're in a post-racial society, even though 2020 happened. And on the school front in particular, I'm thinking of how a lot in most states funding is tied to tax dollars based on the investment of our home value, and how that is like putting the onus on lower income communities to make the gap based on the loss of funding from the state and federal level.
Right.
So the community I grew up in outside of Dallas was very multiracial, but it was also like solidly upper middle class. So we had a High School Musical type facility, and that was just kind of like a thing.
Right.
But it was less about race, and it was more about class. And I'm also thinking about, from I think Steve mentioned, from a cultural perspective, what are the main forms of media people consume, and how there's a transition from like popular TV shows in the 70s to the 80s depicting, Archie Bunker and kind of a working class, middle class guy, to then you have like the Cosby's in the 80s, like, oh, yeah, this is like we're in a post-racial society, and oh, it's the doctor and the lawyer, and that has continued to evolve into TV that we can consume today. It's like less about working class
everyday people, the more about affluent, upper level life.
Yeah. I'd like to, coming off of that, I'd like to ask, because I am in sorry, I just need to be somewhere, but I was still good. But I want to ask this question because I think people read a lot of stuff. Look at, on one hand, the sixties. The sixties are elements of capitalism, enormous socialism, imperial settings, then together, then you get the late sixties, early seventies, enormous rank and file, working class upsurge, strikes all over the country, a lot of it led in opposition to established union leaderships. You have read about, you have Drum and the League of Black Revolutionary Workers, you have the Panthers kind of talking about, and that's another question, maybe moving from the notion of the underclass as a revolutionary agent to the working class as a revolutionary agent. You have all this going on. You have the Lordstown strike, which I think these are young workers fed up with the speed of the assembly line in Ohio, Lordstown, rebelling against it. That's against the leadership of the UAW. All of this is going on. What happened? Why did it not lead to a revival of a kind of labor question, more social revolutionary? What happened? What happened? Why? Why do you think? Yeah.
Capitalism change, like you said, it was a new phase of capitalism. In labor, even though it might have been organized enough to do the strikes and really criticize stability, it wasn't organized for this new phase of capitalism. Its power, capital could move that. It had less control, less regulation, broad. So the strike at the factory was no longer as powerful as it was 10 years ago.
Yeah, I think this is just kind of, another point, but I think one position that gets overlooked is the reconfiguration of the Black political leadership that takes place. So on one hand, you have a kind of radical nationalist movement that, I think like Dan Bond, for instance, writes the city is Black. There's some essay where he's talking about it's like the colonial oppressed population that use local government as a way to sort of reclaim. So you have that radical variant, but then you also have the much more co-opted. I mean, there's a transformation that happens in this period that's often not understood or I think left out.
Right.
It creates another fraction. It's not this or right identification.
Yeah.
Also this kind of.
Would you go so far as to call them managers of discontent, or they don't play it?
I think that's one aspect.
Yeah.
And that they begin to identify their advancement, their achievements, their recognition, and that becomes almost like a substitute for a class politics.
Yeah.
So there's an appropriation of a kind of racialized identity within the Black political leadership that also tends to reinforce this kind of non-recognition of bias.
Yeah.
The recession of 74-75 was really transformative.
I'm sorry.
The recession of 1974-75 was really
right.
transformative. Because that's when I was about to graduate from college. And we had the sense, graduating from Yale, we're not the thing, we're not the auto. But it was a sense that post-World War II cornucopia was done.
Mm-hmm.
And it just, there was a real sense of a turn towards much nastier. My friends and I were joking about like growing potatoes in the backyard. Just this sense that the 30 glorious years in French colony were done.
Yeah.
And that the work that really induced fear in working class.
Yeah. Did you understand that?
Oh, I remember very well. Yeah.
Not you. Yeah, I'm sure you. No, but like, what's the general perception?
Yeah, I think there's evidence.
It was the deepest recession of the 30s. And it's not like, the 50s and 60s recession, pretty mild, unemployment rate might go up, it's also been like the permanent job loss, beginning of the industrialization of the right. And people really felt it.
I had to my father say something similar, and because of this politics. I'm not okay.
But also the shift from, the Soviets, communism, and, the bogeyman, whatever, to those nasty Muslims, the Arabs, who were keeping oil away from us, and causing the energy crisis, and all the rest of that, that I think contributed to whatever fear the economics of the recession and the industrialization produced.
I'm really struck by the Kerner Commission quote, as well as the Wallace quote, because it's funny how it almost seems like not much has changed. Like the Kerner Commission sounds so much like the 1619 project.
Yeah.
There's all of this racism is like 18 the original sin, very spiritualistic. And I mean, Wallace kind of just sounds like a modern sort of populist MAGA. He's like the exact same. Like
He's the progenitor. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, and so I mean, this might seem like an immature question, but when you say what happened, the labor question is this larger one you're posing, not the sort of small war, but the question of what is labor to do to overthrow system capital. It seemed like the Red Scare was not just the thing that had it in its agenda to get the physical people out, like get the unions out of the CIO and get those people on the streets, but also to wipe out the idea of that question, right? To say that question is not to be asked, right? And so my question to you is, if that is the case, then it's about getting that out of the imagination, not just the individual communists.
Absolutely.
Then why do we talk about the Red Scare in the past tense? Like, is it not still kind of active?
Yes, it's part of our DNA of the culture of our cultural DNA. There's a kind of allergy that's been there for a very long time, going back to the Paris Commune, which frightened the devil out of middle class and upper class Americans. There is no reason to talk about it in the past tense, except obviously certain things. There is no Soviet, there is no communist threat. So what is more nakedly revealed, in my view, by nonetheless the persistence of that fear, is that it's really not about foreign threats, that it's really about domestic matters in the end. National security elites worried about America's imperial place in the world, and they had to contend with the Soviet Union, and they had to contend with huge communist parties in Italy and France after World War II. So for them, it was a foreign policy question. But for McCarthy and all the McCarthyites, and all, McCarthyite language is all about these elites born with silver spoons in their mouth and telling the rest of us what to do. It's really aimed at a domestic elite, the Dean Atkins of the world, John McCloy's of the world. These are the architects of post-war American foreign policy that we can really resent is that they are this upper class that feels that. So in that sense, today's announcing of woke capitalism as a kind of socialist or even communist phenomenon is a kindred thing. Yeah. Is that my?
Sure, but I just mean literally, like today it's very hard for a leading union figure to say, I'm a communist. Like we love Sarah Nelson, she would not say that. Right. So many people just would not say that.
Yeah, I see what you're saying.
And there's no sense of union, but it's like it's still there. And so what I'm asking is, did the Red Scare just evolve into a phase change? Like when you say what happened in the 70s, it occurs to me that any leading figure who might have connected those dots, saying, look, racism is one class struggle, we can't divide these two things, racism, class struggle, they were all killed, right? And their organizations were liquidated. So
there were a handful around.
Right. Like, would you say like COINTELPRO, which is an extension of the Red Scare?
Yeah.
Was a phase change of the Red Scare.
Yeah.
Where the state took a heavier hand.
Very heavy.
So like it kind of has it's still here, right? Like no, we necessarily wouldn't go into arguments today and go, I'm communist, because it'd be like maybe this is gonna.
Yes, it's still a very powerful thing in our culture. But there is Bernie Sanders. But the reason I mentioned that is because you couldn't for a very long time say working class. You shouldn't say that. It was part of this linguistic purge. It was purging the grammar. I think somebody once said grammar is the house of being. Well, our house became much smaller. And you couldn't say them. And he deliberately, people made inroads about it. the working families part, I don't care one way or the other. But that locution is about trying, it's good. I don't mean, I mean,
Focus
it's an end run around class. And Bernie Sanders goes out of his way to always say working class. I'm not saying Bernie Sanders, but there's a little change so that it's a little less because of things that have happened in the last 15 years that you can begin to talk a language that for a long time. And so, yeah, that's part of what that things change. COINTELPRO, I almost went to jail for 25 years. Thanks to COINTELPRO. I was accused of plotting to blow up Liberty Bell. That's a COINTELPRO operation in Philadelphia. And it was very frightening. I didn't want to go there. No, no, I was it's already cracked. Yeah.
Go after the Pentagon.
I just want to pull out, I was really struck in the documentary on Drum.
Yeah.
You know, of course, there was a melange of ideology, whatever, but the leadership, it wasn't a narrow nationalist conception.
No,
it was
not
a
at all.
class
Yeah,
conception.
yeah.
And
That's
it
why-
wasn't that kind of racial pessimism
Yeah.
that you were alluding to, right? It was, you know, yes, you know, white workers are also exploited, and
Right.
they may not get it so quickly
Right.
and, you know,
Right.
so well or whatever, but there was that vision, but there was no partner for them,
Yeah.
right? And that's
That's
sort
what
of
they keep speaking and hoping will
right,
emerge.
and that's sort of
Yeah.
the tragedy of the
Yeah.
moment,
Yeah.
and the small pieces of the anti-war movement, new left, whatever, that began to turn more toward class politics in that period, roughly speaking,
Yeah.
were frequently, you know, of course, small and isolated, all that, but also like crazily left, like.
They're either
you know,
left or some of them devoted the rest of their life to colonizing the work, but they were invisible.
Right.
They went into the factories and did that.
Right.
Good, but you know, they were not visible.
Right. And so, but today, you know, what is like the questions of like the language today would be about intersectionality, right? And how is that, you know, like, who was the League for Revolutionary Black Worker kind of formation today, or where is the mixture of the race question and the labor question, you know, articulated or happening, and it's much harder to find.
It is.
Just one other quick thing, which is that, again, in the periodization, like you had labor leaders even in the 60s and 70s who would join Michael Harrington, Steve Sockers, and while he or she would statement or a letter or whatever, with the singer and you know whatever, like, and so there was this kind of vestige of
It was always
socialism or
Yeah.
whatever, and after the neoliberal turn, even those enders, you know, kind of disappeared at that kind of national level.
Oh, yes, I'm sorry.
Okay. So, it was asked, what did, I guess two things. Chris Marker's like winning the cat.
I'm sorry.
I love that movie.
So Chris Marker's winning the cat.
Oh, right.
Tragedy.
Yeah.
That he makes this wonderful statement. He says, when you let fail to realize the life, there's nothing more to do. My question in some sense is maybe the myopia of the left, but also, I guess, to add to that, how much do the end of the Vietnam War kind of impact the end towards?
I don't know. What do you think?
I mean,
I don't know.
I'm trying to give. I mean, that's like why did it?
Yeah. No, I
So,
understand.
so
That was a good question.
and I just asked that because I really like when did that okay, so before violence.
Yeah.
How much?
The end of the Vietnam War, in my argue, eliminated the last, not vestige, but the last current within the new left student movement of anti-capitalism. And I'm not saying the anti-war movement or anti-capitalist, certainly it's not, but there were parts of it that were decidedly talking about imperialism and in a way that we've talked in this class before about the golden year, the heyday of the labor question. It covered all terrains, including war. War was seen as a class question. that's what people like, well, and Socialist Party in America. After the Social Democrats all throughout Europe vote to war credits to their government, Socialist Party of America does not support the war. So in that sense, it may spell the last sounding, because no matter how powerful militancy and radicalism are not the same thing. However, militant one's demand for racial and gender equality and how worthwhile and important those are, they are not inherently anti-capitalist. They may be at some moment, they may not be at some other moment. They're not now, I would argue. And so the dying away of an capitalist culture is part of that is embedded in the world. So anyway, so one more thing.
I'm just gonna say, this is all making me think of the loss of their spaces, because we're talking about like where is that like next generation of organizers and leaders? And I think it's very easy to like sit here in this room and talk about, oh, well, they're here, or they're in New York, or they're in these larger cities. But when I talk to my friends back home in Texas, there's no real like space to go to talk about these issues. You have to sit in a car and drive, upwards of 30 minutes, 45 minutes, an hour to get to a central location. And I think on the one hand, the pandemic has made virtual meetings like a godsend for a lot of groups outside of major cities to meet and have conversations. On the other hand, a lot of this work does need to be done still in person. And so I think it is nice that we are all more connected from a social media perspective, from a global media perspective. But I also think there's a real loss and like that sense of physical community that is creating that tension of we are having these conversations, but there's no real like momentum to like do anything about it in a way that I think was maybe easier 40, 50, 60 years ago.
Oh, I strongly agree with that. No, let me just tell you, just the readings, I think Jeremy wants somebody. So the readings for next week, we're gonna, for next session, where we're gonna, one of these issues that we're great, but trying to talk about, is there a revival of the labor question? If so, where it's coming from, how, what does it mean? Anyway, we're going to read an interview with Barbara Ehrenreich about our favorite subject of professional Harold Meyerson, and where we'll essay on the reappearance of the labor question recently. Bernie Sanders has a document you're going to read on his platform for workplace democracy. There's an essay called Dispossessed about this world, this other white world we've been talking about. And then there's an essay called Should We Care About Inequality? So we'll read those, and thank you. This was great.
Oh, can we pass a hat around?
Yeah.
Does anybody have a hat to pass? That's right.
Helmet.
Yeah.
I think Jeremy.
And like 68, really good. Tons of footage.
Go ahead. Can I then move you for tonight?
Sure.
Is that possible?
Do it.
I got
Got my contact? Great.
So you want to leave a paper trail?
Was someone going to do announcements or?
Oh.
Yeah, go ahead.
Oh, I was just gonna say so Carl and I are going to see, and anyone else is obviously welcome to join next week on September 12th at 6:45, a screening of the first year by, I'm not remembering the filmmaker's first name, his last name is Guzman.
First year.
Yeah. It's happening at Anthology Archive, but we'll send an email about it. And then also the International Committee is hosting, or is like getting a group together to see the Battle of Chile, which is another one of its films on this Friday. So yeah, I'm gonna go to the first year, which is on September 12th.
And I also,
Everything else.
I can just say a couple things. One, there's a big social, I heard a bunch of like Central Brooklyn, North Brooklyn people. There's this weekend at I think 1 p.m. in McCarran Park, there's gonna be a big like kickball competition and general picnic and sort of end of summer vibes. So come out to McCarran Park. It's Saturday, yeah. So like a long afternoon, chilling in the park. And electoral season is shockingly, horrifyingly upon us. So Monday night, DSA is having a September 11th forum, which we've already been castigated by the right for daring to do politics on such a sacred day. I mean, obviously, we're mourning the Pinochet coup, but so Monday, September 11th, citywide electoral working group is having a forum where 2 candidates are applying for a DSA endorsement for a seat in Queens. If you've done any electoral work in Queens or Brooklyn in the last year, you have you are eligible to vote in that. And then one or both or none of those candidates might go on to branch forums in the coming weeks. So pay attention to that.
Mark your calendar for citywide conference on October 20th to 21st.
What day?
October 20th to 21st. More information.
Thanks, everybody. Please just fold up your chairs and put them to the side and come back in 2 weeks with the readings that Steve mentioned. Thanks, Steve. Thank you.
Hey, how are you?
I think it's political.education at Socialism. Political.education at Socialism. Figure it out.
I love that James Bond. I read it as. I read it as part
That's cool that you.
Yeah.
We also interested in class.
I also like realize.
Great.